Hi everyone, I'm Danica. I'm the Technical Workshops Director, and in this first workshop, I'm going to teach you how to make Excel macros. So first, I'm just going to go over the general steps, and then we can walk through an example together. I sent out, or the link for the example data sheet for you to all use is in this past weekly email under the description for this event. I think it was sent out on the 12th if you want to search for that. But you should be able to just open that file and it should be called, I think, macros underscore, it's called macros underscore file one. And you can just open that in the desktop app. Yeah, and then I'll walk you through that example after everyone has that open. But first, I'm just going to show you the general steps right now. So to make a macro in Excel first, you need to prepare Excel. You should probably only have to do these steps one time, but you need to enable macros in Excel, and then you need to add the developer tab because that's where all of the macro functions are stored in Excel. And then after that, you can just start making the basic macro, which I would say is about 6 steps. So you're going to start recording the macro, you're going to perform the commands. All these commands or the things that you do to the data is going to be turned into code. And then, so you're just going to stop recording. That's going to tell the computer that you're done making code. You're going to look at the code and add comments if you want. So just explaining what each part of the code meant, what you did to the data. You can save the macro as an Excel macro enabled workbook, and then you can check to see that it works on other data. All right, so let's get into the example. I got this example data sheet. It was in the description box of Cody Baldwin's YouTube video, Learn Macros in 7 Minutes. I highly recommend that video. That's what I used to teach myself how to do this, except his data sheet was like 500 rows and I just shortened it to 50 rows to make it simpler. But the YouTube link is right there if you'd like. And also if you're having trouble finding the link for the example data sheet, it's also right here. So first, we are going to do the preparation. So I'm going to share my screen with you. All right, so when you open the data sheet that I shared, this is what it should look like. If you see nothing, it just means you have to scroll up. I don't know why, but every time I open it myself on my computer, it like is on like row 500 and I just have to scroll up. So to add the developer or to enable macros first, we're going to go to File, Options. We're going to go to Trust Center Settings, Macro Settings. And then we're just going to make sure this little bubble that says Enable All Macros is selected. And it can seem kind of scary or sketchy because it says not recommended, potentially dangerous code can run. But just be conscientious. Like, don't be going online and running random code from, non-reliable sources. Just be smart about that and you shouldn't really have a problem. So, and then I just close this little tab. And then since we're here, we're also going to add the developer tab. So I click on the customize ribbon right here. And then just make sure that you check this box that says developer. And then you can click OK. For this X out, in my case. So the developer tab will appear right here. And this is where all of your macros functions are kind of stored. So now that we have done our necessary preparation, we can start recording the macro. And then we're going to perform the commands and stop recording the macro. So I'm going to click record macro. And I would like to name it loans are super awful! Exclamation point. Now let's just use awful. So in between each word, you do want to use underscores. I'm not sure why, but that is just how it wants you to name the macro. A description is also great, so you can just say, this macro is, and macro really all that a macro is saved code that is going to run commands for you so you can save time. So basically it's just saying this code is used to format, let's say these are for weekly loan reports. You're going to be using this macro pretty often. And then just click OK. So now we are going to start, actually editing the data, performing commands, as I like to call it. And this is what is going to be stored as code. And when I did the workshop the first time, somebody asked me, if you accidentally do something that you didn't want to do you have to like undo anything? Or like, how do you take care of that situation? So later, what I'll show you is the code is all written out in this macro, and that's how, and then when you save it, it's basically just saved code. And when you run it again, the code runs and the computer does all the things for you. So let's say that I change the text to red, the header row. Let's say this top row right here, I mean to fill it with red background, but I actually fill it with red text on accident. What do I do about that? So what you're going to do about that, there's no undo button, but essentially when it's running the code, if you recorded the code to turn the text red and you didn't mean to do that, you can just change it back to black. And then when the computer runs that code later on new data, it runs it so fast that you're not going to see it go red, and then back to black. It's just going to be black. It's just going to do that so fast that it's going to end up the way that you intended. So just don't freak out if you make a mistake. Just do the task, do another command to get it where you want it to be. So first, let's say I want to change all of this data to Calibri, font Calibri. Whoop, I don't know if I accidentally highlighted an extra. Okay, great. Now let's say I want to format the header row, so we're going to make this, do the back button quick because I forgot to start the macro. That is the most important thing. You don't want to do the whole macro and then realize you didn't even start recording. Okay, great. I did start recording. Never mind, I panicked for no reason. All right. Home. Change to Calibri. Now let's say we want to format the header row. Let's say we want it bold with a red fill. Okay, looks good. Now, a lot of these columns just look like really big numbers, but they're actually dollar amounts. And let's say we want to show that in the data sheet. So I'm going to select multiple columns. And to do that, I want to hover so that you see like this little down arrow, click, and then click Control before I click again. So I hover over another column, click Control, and then click, and then it will keep multiple columns selected at the same time. If you want to do individual columns at a time, that works as well. But I just think that this is a lot faster. And then just click the dollar sign, and that will give a little dollar amounts. If you see numbers like this in cells, it simply just means you have to widen the columns because the number is so big that it won't fit. Okay, looks great. Now let's say I don't want this interest rate column. It's kind of useless to me. We'll delete it. Let's say I also don't want this home ownership column. I'll just delete that. So let's say I want to add a column. You can just click and then insert entire column. Now I want to call this new column debt to income. And make sure you do underscores. You can widen that a little bit. So another cool thing about macros is it can store calculations for you, and this can be super useful in like engineering, where if we're doing a bunch of equations and we don't want to constantly be manually like if we're getting the same data and we're supposed to do calculate the same calculations every week, you don't want to have to type in every single time, this is how you calculate debt to income. We can just record it in the code, and then next week when we get the loans report, or next week when we get whatever data, we can just run the code and the computer will just do it for us. It saves a lot of time. So let's say the debt to income is equal to your installment divided by your annual income. And your annual income, or your monthly income, sorry. And your monthly income is just your annual income divided by 12. So debt to income is equal to installment. So I'm just going to click right here, divided by monthly income, which is simply annual income, divided by 12, and I'm going to close out parentheses. I'm going to click enter to complete the calculation. I'm just going to drag it all the way down so it makes all these calculations. And this needs to be a percentage, so I'm just going to click right here. That looks great. So let's say I also want to sort this data from highest to lowest debt to income percentage. So I'm going to go to data, sort. I think you do need to have this column selected. Just like that. Sort. And I want it largest and smallest. Great. Now let's say I see all of these cells that say delinquent and I want them to say charged off. So like you can do in a Word document, you do Control F, and that also works in Excel. So just do Control F, and we can, that also means we can also replace it. So we want to find the cells that say, delinquent, and we want to replace that with the phrase charged off, and click replace. So all of these now say charged off that used to say delinquent. Now let's say I really want those to pop, like I really want those to stand out. I can highlight this column and I can format it especially for that. So let's say highlight cell rules from conditional formatting equal to format cells that are equal to charged off with light red fill. Great. All right. I think that's all for the commands that I want to do. I think, let's say that's all that your boss really wants you to do each week for formatting in this scenario for the weekly loans report. So then you're going to go to developer and you're going to stop recording the macro, or basically tell the computer that that's all you want stored as code. So now if we want, let me just go back to my general how-to list. So we did all these commands and we stopped recording. And now if we want, this is optional, but if you're going to be doing or using this macro or the code for a really, really long time, and you want to remember what each part of the code or all the commands that you did, but you didn't necessarily like make a list like I did, you could add comments into the code section so that if you come back to the code later, you can understand all the commands that you did. And you can just do that by typing a simple apostrophe in the code. So you can go to macros and make sure the one that you just made is selected. And you can just click on it. And so this is what the code looks like. You can just tab and do an apostrophe. And this part of the code, change the font to Calibri. I also know that because it says selection font, Calibri. Anytime it says end with, that means that's the end of the code for one command. So this section of the code, change it to Calibri. Looks like this section of the code made the header roll bold. And you could do that on and on if you wanted. Just at your own desire, I guess. And then you can just close out of that. Now, this part's also pretty important. You need to save the macro, and you need to make sure that you save it as the right type. It can't just be an Excel workbook. It has to be an Excel macro-enabled workbook, or it won't save the macro into the worksheet. I think it'll just save the final data. So it'll be like it'll essentially be like you formatted one weekly loan report, but it's not going to save the code for you to run it next week. So you haven't saved any time. It won't save your macro for you, so it'll kind of make all of the work that you just did kind of pointless. So this is super important. Excel macro enabled workbook. And then click save. Now I want to check to see that it works. So somebody also asked, what if you get data that's not exactly the same as the data that you got that you made the macro with? So it doesn't have to be exactly this, or like she asked, like, what if there was like an extra column? The code is going to run, you can run that macro on any data, but it's only going to apply to what it applied to before. So for example, the commands change the font data or the data font to Calibri, okay? That will apply to every column. Format the header row bold with red background. I'm pretty sure that will also format all of the columns, even if the original data didn't have that one column, the code is going to still affect that additional column in the new data. Delete interest rate and home ownership columns. Yeah, so let's say your boss gives you like completely different data and it doesn't have those certain, let's see if I can explain this a little bit better. So the way that the code works is it's going to, and I mean, macros are essentially meant for data that is similar every time because, you know, you're making that so it's going to save you time later. You're usually making it for repetitive tasks so that you save all this time. Instead of manually doing it every single week, you're just going to run the code. But if we look at it technically in the code, for example, when we deleted columns, it says, or when we inserted a column, yeah, entire column for selection, delete, shift, X to left, range, C1, select, columns G, columns D, we deleted. So we deleted columns D and G. So if we got a different worksheet, and for example, it was called something different. So we deleted the interest rate column and we deleted the home ownership column. Let's say it was called something different, but it's still columns D and G, it's still gonna get deleted because in the code, it's not, the computer isn't gonna be reading, oh, like where's the interest rate column, where's the home ownership column, delete those. It's saying, no, you deleted column D and you deleted column G. So it does matter to an extent how different the data is when you're running the macro. But if it's similar data that you're kind of getting every single week, that's basically why you learn the macro, is to save you time. But like in Leah's question, for example, she asked if there was an extra column, would that column be affected? To some extent. So let's see here. Actually, I really don't think it would be affected because the code takes into account the commands that you did on the data the first time. So if we look at the code, it says A1 050 A1 N50. So it's saying from column A, row 1, all the way to O50, from A, yeah, from A, so it's like this whole chunk is what got changed to Calibri in the original data. And then if you're going to add another column, it's not going to get changed because the computer didn't say, oh, this chunk got changed. It's only accounting for this change in the code. So actually, it probably, most of it will not be affected, I don't think. But if that is a technical question though, usually, and so I would just consult the macro code to really get a descriptive answer on that. But I really don't think it would be affected in any way. But I guess her question more generally was, I guess, does it matter if the new data is different? Will it get affected? And that really, it depends. Like if it's a whole new column, like a whole new column added on additionally, that's not going to get affected. But if you had a new data sheet and there was like a column inserted in the middle, that would screw everything up because, you know, it said, oh, we deleted columns G and what was it, D? Those columns that you intended to delete before might not be the same columns that you want to delete now because everything got screwed up if you had a different row somewhere else. So all the technical placement of the data, the technical placement of the data on the spreadsheet is what gets imprinted into the code, and that's what's going to matter. So if the actual placement isn't changed, like it's not, nothing is going to come of it. But again, that is a hard question to answer. It really depends on the code. But if you're just gonna paste like a whole other random column tack it on the end of the spreadsheet, it's not going to get affected. And if you insert it in the middle, however, that's a different story. All right, that was a long answer to the question, but where did I leave off? That was a good question though that Leah asked earlier. So I have saved it and now I am going to check it, I believe. So let's say this is a different data sheet that you just got. So to test Leah's theory, maybe I will just tack on a whole column and see if that even does anything. If I'm correct, it should not. So let's just call it something random. Let's just call it macro. And I'll just do the number 1 because why not? And we'll drag it down so it's in every, there we go. So now I want to run this macro and check to see that it works. So we're going to go back to the developer tab. We're going to go to macros. And here, make sure you have the right one selected. And then just click run. Yeah, so my suspicion was correct. You just tack on a whole column, it's not going to get affected at all because it wasn't accounted for in the code. When you first made the code, it said, oh, you did this command to this many rows, or to this many rows and this many columns. So if you just tack on a whole column, that's not accounted for in the code. But like I said, if this was pasted in like right here, that would be a different story. If this got inserted right here and everything else got pushed one column over, this would get changed to Calibri. The header would get formatted differently. This one would not. Because only this section gets formatted. All right. So that is everything I have. Actually, 1 second. I do kind of just want a quick recap everything that we did. So we did the preparation, but like I said, you should only have to do that once. We enabled macros, and then we added the developer tab. And, excuse me, I have to sneeze. To actually make the macro is just 6 simple steps. So we started recording the macro. We made the macro by performing commands to the data. We stopped recording the macro. We looked at the macro code and added comments if we wanted to. We saved the macro as an Excel macro enabled workbook, and we checked to see that it worked. All right, I want to thank everyone so much for coming. It was really fun to teach you guys how to make macros. I hope everyone had a fun, constructive time, and thank you so much, and I'll see you at the next workshop.